Welcome to Prep and Play, where we have conversations about safer sexual pleasure. This podcast is dedicated to empowering listeners through open, honest discussions surrounding keeping our minds, bodies, and spirits healthy while being sexually active.
Hi, my name is Danielle, and I'm the Rural and Minority Outreach Specialist at AIDS Alabama South, and today I have with me
Chance Shaw. I am Director of Prevention at AIDS Alabama South.
And today we're going to be talking a little bit about advances in HIV care, including U equals U. So we're going to go over a little bit of the historical context, some significant discoveries along the way, and some advances in treatment. And it's super important to understand these concepts and how they've led to effective HIV management regimes and HIV prevention regimes. So to start us off, before HIV, there was AIDS. Chance, can you tell us a little bit about AIDS?
Well, we've got to back up even further than that. Before there was AIDS, it was just, they didn't even know what it was. So when they first started seeing the first reported cases, they were noticing symptoms. Things like Kaposi's sarcoma, certain types of pneumonia, things like that, and they didn't know what was causing it. They just knew that they were seeing a bunch of people who shouldn't have these things being diagnosed with them. Primarily in that first couple of months, it was cis white gay men in New York and in certain parts of California. And honestly, we know now those are the ones that were diagnosed with it because those are the ones that had access to healthcare at that time. We know now that it wasn't 30 or 40 cases at that point. It was probably several thousand. Just those people didn't have access to health care in order to be able to be diagnosed. But when they started seeing it, it got a bunch of different names, a lot of which were derogatory. They called it a gay cancer, they called it the gay plague, they called it GRID, which was gay-related immune disorder, which that actually was the official name for a little while. Mm-hmm. You also had people calling it the 4-H disease, because at that time they thought the only people that got it were homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin users, and Haitians.
Haitians, interesting.
That's actually, that could be a topic for a whole other session. We know now HIV also has a separate branch that developed in Haiti. I'm unsure of the causes myself. I haven't dug that much into it, but there is a specific HIV subtype that is typically only found in Haiti or people of Haitian descent. They did figure out that they saw a lot of cases in Haitians, though, early on. So it was a couple of years before they started actually getting definitive answers. I think it took about 1.5 years, 2 years to get to the point where they named it AIDS, or acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And at that point, they still were unsure of what was causing it. They just knew it was a collection of symptoms that were more than likely related and with a common cause. In 1984, if I remember correctly, they discovered what would go on to be called HIV. And at that time, they called it HTLV3. Off the top of my head, I cannot remember what that stands for. I know H was still human. L was, I think it was lymphocyte. And then V was virus. But they knew at that point that it was a virus that affected the white blood cells in your immune cells in your body, and so they named it accordingly. About 1 year later, they came up with a consensus to call it HIV. So it's been since about 1985 that we've called it HIV. Now, there was a lot of initial confusion about who could get HIV, about how it was transmitted, all kinds of things like that. And as I said, they called it the 4-H disease, but it was more than just those people that were getting HIV at the time. We also saw perinatal transmission, or transmission from mother to child, which that means that women were also affected. Mm-hmm. So we saw women, we saw children, we saw heterosexual people, many more than just those 4 categories they initially described. I guess I've already talked about the discovery of the virus, but from there, they started putting research into how to take care of people living with HIV and how to treat HIV. And that led to the first medication in 1987, which was commonly called AZT. It's actually in a lot of media from the time. You hear AZT referenced or mentioned. Even there's a line in Rent about two characters having their AZT break. And it was their reminder to take their pills for the day. But AZT, while it was a great breakthrough, it also had its drawbacks. It could be really rough on a person's body, especially if they're already dealing with immune disorders and they're already, struggling with other issues caused by those. So it could be rough on the body. They also kind of rushed it through approval. And knowing what we know now, they should have done more study on it. But at the time, it was really viewed almost as unethical to not start spreading and start using this medication to treat HIV. While it was greatly effective versus nothing, it wasn't that effective as compared to some of the stuff that we have today. It took a while to work. As I mentioned, it was rough on the body. It was also really expensive and really unaccessible. At that point, because it was so unaccessible, you had people who were going out of the country to get medications, things like Dallas Buyers Club, that story. You also had people running underground pharmacies where if someone who was privileged enough to be able to get AZT passed, someone would go and get the remainder of that medication before anything happened to it, and they would pass it on to someone else who needed that medication, and they had essentially an informal waiting list. And that wasn't just in big cities, that was all over the place. There was even something like that here in Mobile, where it was an underground pharmacy essentially taking care of people living with HIV who couldn't get access to the medication through normal means. Actually, I'm not going to say where it was, but when I found out about this existed, I lived about 5 or 6 houses from where it was. Oh, wow. So it was kind of right there under our noses. So with that, it was a while before we saw any other medications or anything like that. We saw a lot of, during that time, trying to manage the symptoms and make people comfortable, I guess is the best way to put it. They wanted to make sure that people could retain their dignity, could have some sense of comfort, could have some sense of normalcy at what at that time was a death sentence, essentially.
And so when we do start to see medications other than AZT in the market, how does that look in the process of developing those and getting those to the people who need them?
So, all right, so it was 1987 when AZT came out. Between 1987 and 1996, with the introduction of HAART, or highly active antiretroviral therapy, you had a bunch of different companies trying a bunch of different things to create medications. A lot of times they were still trying to essentially work in reverse and treat the symptoms, hoping it would treat the virus. But they did start getting some promising research on how to treat the virus itself. And what they discovered was they could interrupt the life cycle of the virus. And that was going to be the most effective way to treat HIV. Once they discovered that they could interrupt the life cycle, it was a race of where was the best place to interrupt it, how were they going to do it, and what medications would do it with the least other issues, side effects, anything like that. So it took a little bit of time, and with that, most of these companies went through and they'd start testing in labs, they'd start testing on animals, they'd move on. Once they had something that was promising, they'd move on to people, and at that point they were testing on volunteers. Because there wasn't a lot of other medication or other options, you had a lot of people willing to try out experimental medications because it might give them some semblance of hope. And it did for a lot of people. We started seeing some of these medications being more effective, and that eventually, once they had the research behind it, they could get FDA approval, and they brought these medications to market. As I mentioned, that was 1996 when they really started coming to the market. And for a lot of people, they went from their doctors telling them, oh, well, you may have 3 to 6 months to live, or you may have 2 to 3 years to live, to, well, let's start this medication and let's see how it goes. So that's really the moment where it became, and where we started using the terminology from dying of AIDS to living with HIV. That's the moment where that change really happened. Now, I kind of touched on this a little with that you've got 3 to 6 months, or you've got 2 to 3 years to live. But HAART, and well, now it's called just ART, antiretroviral therapy, it started giving people their life back. With that, they went from those short expectancies, 3 to 6 months, 2 to 5 years, however it was. If they were lucky, they may get 10 years. If they were really healthy and really took care of themselves before and took a lot of care of themselves during. But once they could get on ART, it really became, let's just take life as it goes. They didn't really know how long to tell people that they could expect, but they knew they didn't have to tell people, well, you probably should start making your will. You should probably start making arrangements. It wasn't that, well, this is the end conversation anymore. It also, over time, through the years, those medications, as they introduced more and more and they became simpler, they became more effective, it really took HIV from, like I mentioned, a death sentence, a fatal disease, to now in 2025, most doctors will agree that it's easier to treat HIV than it is to treat diabetes. Mm-hmm. That it's easier to treat HIV than it is, a lot of other things that people are facing. Everything from high blood pressure to obesity, heart disease. It's gotten fairly simple to treat HIV in most cases at a rate that we haven't seen in other diseases progress. So with that, it's made a huge difference in the quality of life, in the life expectancy. Now in 2025, with the medications we have, the treatments we have, the access that we have, someone living with HIV, their life expectancy is roughly the same as someone who isn't living with HIV. I think officially it's a year shorter than someone who isn't living with HIV.
Wow.
But when we're talking about something that 20 years ago, within our lifetimes was a death sentence, to now it's, well, you're pretty much going to live as long as you would have anyways. That's a massive change.
Yeah, and you mentioned it's not just life expectancy, but also quality of life that is improved for people living with HIV. Because now modern medicine has got to the point to where on effective antiretroviral treatment, someone can become undetectable and not pass the virus on to other people. And we like to think of U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. And so essentially, when someone is living with HIV, we can perform a viral load test, which is a test that tells us how many copies of HIV, the virus, are in a milliliter of a person's blood. The standard for undetectable, or the standard for viral suppression, is what was undetectable like a few years back. So if the test didn't measure any copies of HIV in a person's blood, then that person was considered undetectable. And if they were undetectable, they could not transmit the virus, which is still true. Nowadays, it's like the tests have gotten better and better, and so we're able to detect fewer and fewer copies. But a person is still virally suppressed at 200 copies per milliliter.
That's correct. At 200 copies, we consider that virally suppressed. And that's really the threshold that we aim for. And a lot of times you'll still hear people refer to that as undetectable as well, mm-hmm. which isn't technically correct, but it's not incorrect either. When they first started researching undetectable 15, 20 years ago, the tests at the time could only detect down to 200 copies. So anything less than that, they considered undetectable, and it made it really catchy, essentially, to say undetectable equals untransmittable. You don't quite get the same catchiness from virally suppressed.
It's true. It may not be catchy, but it's true. If someone is virally suppressed, they cannot transmit the virus to another human being, which is radical considering that it used to be a death sentence. It used to be a sentence of no contact with others when people were so afraid that the virus could be spread through casual contact. And now it's like, yeah, those things that could have passed on the virus don't, because treatment has advanced to the point to where someone can be suppressed in that way.
Absolutely. And in that, I'm glad you kind of touched on that, on transmission. So with viral suppression and U equals U, we know it stops the methods of transmission. And with that, in the early days, they weren't sure how HIV was transmitted. When they first started researching into it, all they really knew was most of the people coming down with it were gay. And then they knew, like I said, the 4-H. So they kind of figured out it might have something to do with sex. It might have something to do with blood. They weren't quite sure, though. You had a lot of people saying that it could be spread through casual contact. You had people saying that, it could be spread through touching, through breathing around a person, coughs, sneezes, through saliva, all kinds of stuff like that. But they pretty quickly narrowed it down to it's transmitted through just a couple of bodily fluids: blood, semen, breast milk, anal and vaginal fluid, pre-ejaculate, those types of things. Well, not even those types of things, those specific things. Those 6, that's it. For any of the other bodily fluids to even stand a chance at transmitting HIV, they'd have to be mixed with blood, and that's something that you don't commonly see, saliva mixed with blood or sweat mixed with blood, that type of thing. So as they figured that out, we still fight the stigma of how it can be transmitted. I'm trying to remember the saying. There's a saying about a lie will travel faster than the truth.
Yeah.
And think it's around a lie will travel around the world by the time the truth figures out what it is. And that's very true in this. And you had people publicizing these falsehoods about HIV early on, but they didn't nearly give the same attention to the truth. And that's happened with U equals U and viral suppression too. Everybody knows how HIV can be transmitted now, but not as many people know that you can stop that transmission. And it's fairly easy. There's 2 ways primarily that we talk about stopping HIV transmission from a medical standpoint now. And that's going to be TASP and PrEP. TASP is treatment as prevention. It's taking your medication, that ART, and getting to viral suppression. And then PrEP is taking a modified form of ART as a preventative method. It's pre-exposure prophylaxis. And it's, if you know what that means, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's before you're exposed, taking something to block that transmission. And it's highly effective. Right now, they know of absolutely no cases of someone who is virally suppressed transmitting the virus. There are extremely few cases of someone who is compliant and on PrEP, taking it as they're supposed to be, contracting HIV. And honestly, most of those cases involve mitigating factors like modified versions of the virus that may be resistant to those medications, or it comes out that they weren't as adherent as they initially stated. You're supposed to take PrEP every day if you're taking the oral, the pill form, or once every 2 months if you're taking the current shot. And if you miss those, the more you miss, the less effective it becomes. They know the minimum threshold for oral PrEP is taking 4 pills a week. Mm-hmm. If you miss anything more than that, then it's probably not going to be effective.
Yeah, and at 4 pills a week, it's something like 80% effective, I believe.
Right.
And at 7 pills every day, it's around 99.8% effective. So it really does drop off there with less pills.
Right. And that's something, in medicine, you rarely deal with absolutes with 100%. So that 99.98, that's really close, and about as close to perfect as you're going to get. Because there always seems to be an exception. But, with that is an amazing confidence in a medication. And in fact, there are very few medications that have an efficacy rate considered that high.
Very few.